morning, everyone. Thanks, Cheryl, for pulling this together. I really appreciate it. I think it's anytime there's an opportunity for folks getting together and talking about this stuff, I think we definitely want to take advantage of it. Plus, I was also telling Lee, anything that gets me out of the office and not talking about sage grouse right now is actually really, really fun. So let's talk about something not controversial like spotted owls. So I guess I was asked to just take a couple minutes and give a few impressions and maybe kick this off, and I know Debbie and Lee are going to do the same thing. I guess one message is some things have changed, but a lot of things are actually pretty much the same. And so I'd like to make sure that we talk about what's changed and maybe and affirm what is the same for many of us, because we've done a lot of really great work over the last 20 years, and a lot of stuff that we do is sort of proven positive, good approaches to what we do. So I want to make sure folks don't inadvertently stop doing the good stuff they're doing because of the changes in critical habitat that have occurred recently. So I guess I'm just going to recap the basic recovery needs of the spotted owl. We revised the spotted owl recovery plan back in 2011, and you know, the population of the spotted owl, as many of you know, is continuing to decline. We believe the primary reason for that is the barred owl influence. I think certainly on federal lands, we've done a great job at conserving habitat over the last 20 years, and the forest plan from our perspective has been quite successful in that regard. And I think folks here in this room and a lot of your colleagues out in Forest Service and BLM offices I hope feel that way and need to appreciate that. That's certainly our position. So I just want to say both thanks and congratulations. But that doesn't mean, you know, wildlife conservation is more complicated than just saving the habitat, and here we have a great example of that with the barred owl influence and invasion. So we need to manage that issue. But at the same time, we're recommending continuing to conserve, because of that decline, continuing to conserve as much of the best, highest quality spotted owl habitat that we have, regardless of whether it's in reserves or not. And I know that's been what is perceived as a significant change from the forest plan in some people's minds, and that includes good quality habitat in the matrix. I just want to come right out and say that. And the critical habitat rule and the recovery plan reflect that. But we also want to continue the basic Northwest Forest Plan goal of improving habitat. And that means going in and taking active management steps where appropriate to achieve that goal. And where commercial harvest is the primary goal, and so in other words, it's not a restoration goal per se, like thinning in an LSR, where commercial harvest is still the primary goal, and it's an important part of Forest Service and BLM mandate that you use ecological forestry methods to try and minimize those impacts to spotted owl habitat and spotted owls, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So I know there's out in the public, there's a lot of different interpretations of what critical habitat means. Some people, it's a hands-off reserve. If it's designated as critical, you shouldn't do anything in it. And other folks think it's a line on a map that we do once every 5 or 10 or 20 years and then walk away from it. And the reality is it's somewhere in the middle of that. We anticipate actions in critical habitat. If Congress didn't anticipate management actions in critical habitat, they wouldn't have put in the Section 7 consultation context for determining whether there's adverse effects and allowing and permitting a certain amount of adverse effects up to the point of adverse modification, which is not allowed. So, I mean, that just is a sort of a standard Section 7 101 that Fish and Wildlife, and I'm sure many Forest Service and BLM biologists are taught. But at the same time, we have an obligation, both a 7A1 recovery obligation under the ESA and 7A2 to avoid adverse modification and to promote recovery of the species. So we want to make sure that happens. So we're not encouraging folks to go into critical habitat. In fact, the opposite. We're encouraging folks to stay out of critical habitat as much as possible, but if you can't, then here's the next things you should do. So, you know, to sort of reiterate what's changed, critical habitat's gotten a lot larger. We're at, I think, 9.6 million acres. Is that right, Brendan? And I think originally we were, the previous rule was about 5 point something, or so it's not quite double, but it's gotten a lot larger, and I know that's made a lot of folks in this room's job a little harder. And Brian's going to explain why that is when he gets up and talks about habitat modeling, right, Brian? So we have a large area of critical habitat, and we're recommending a more conservative approach for harvesting or impacting critical habitat, including matrix areas. So that's a recommendation from the recovery plan, and the critical habitat designation, in essence, affirms that and maps that out. So if the clear goal of a project is a restoration goal for improving or restoring habitat conditions, whether it's for spotted owls or some other ecological goal that the land manager has, our perspective is you should go forward with that project, even if it is in critical habitat, and even if there are short-term impacts. In other words, I guess we don't want spotted owls and the single species focus with spotted owls to trump everything else. If the land management goals are broader and ecologically based, do them. Obviously do whatever steps you can to minimize impacts, not just to spotted owls, but to salmon and to merlets and everything else. But critical habitat is not a hands-off reserve, and just want to kind of make that clear and take this opportunity to express that sort of formally to folks on Fish and Wildlife Service's behalf. In contrast, if the primary goal of the project is a commercial project, it's meeting your other mandates for under the forest plan or or whatever comes after the forest plan, and I know there's all kinds of options being considered legislatively right now. If the primary goal is a commercial goal, you should do everything you can to first avoid critical habitat and avoid take of spotted owls. After you've exhausted those options, then we'll work with you to permit that project and avoid jeopardy or avoid adverse modification of critical habitat. And that means, as many of you know, introducing reasonable and prudent measures and trying to, best management practices. We believe, generally, ecological forestry prescriptions, as outlined in the recovery plan, as outlined in the critical habitat rule, and as discussed in recently published literature, would be a great help at reducing those impacts, at distributing those impacts in a way that's more appropriate, not just for spotted owls ecologically, but for a lot of other species and land management goals. And so what we'd like to do at a landscape level is work with you to distribute impacts in critical habitat, if you're working in critical habitat, over space and time, so that the critical habitat can still function as intended for the recovery of the owl. But we recognize there will be areas where people will need to work inside critical habitat. So I don't know if that's too sort of general and big a picture, but I'm around for the whole day, and we've got at least half a dozen Fish and Wildlife staff here who would be happy to answer any questions, specific scenarios, what ifs, all that kind of thing. So I think you're up next. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Am I close enough? Yeah, it sounds like I am. So thanks. I mean, I think, Cheryl, you said at the beginning, we've been at this for 25 years or something like that, and we're still committed to restoring the habitat that's necessary and recovering this species. And we feel like the Forest Service feels like this critical habitat rule is complementary to our objectives and our mandates, and we're going to be able to carry it out successfully to achieve the needs of ecosystem restoration across our lands in the Northwest. We definitely feel like it's consistent with our recent initiatives moving towards accelerated restoration across the landscape level. We, over the last several years, have been taking a larger landscape approach look at many of our projects, and this critical habitat rule fits with that approach. Along those lines, and Paul mentioned it several times, the rule, and this is a really key point for us, recognizes that we need to maintain and conserve that high quality habitat that exists on the landscape, but that's not enough. We also have to actively manage the areas that are, have been treated in the past, have been burned in the past, have had other agents of change acted upon them. So we need to continue to manage the landscape in a way to achieve the recovery objectives, because just taking a complete hands-off approach is not going to get where we want to go. So I think as you developed the critical habitat plan, we reviewed and commented and had opportunities over the last several years. We really worked together to craft that so that we could achieve those active management objectives. So I appreciate that. It also really, as I said at the beginning, looks at this larger landscape perspective, and it encourages projects to be approached from an integrated viewpoint so that if you're managing for wildlife habitat, you can provide a commercial product. If you're managing for a commercial product, you can provide wildlife habitat. They're not mutually exclusive. And so to the extent that we can achieve those multiple objectives in one project by looking at a larger landscape, I think the recovery plan and the critical habitat rule encourage that. And we're interested in doing that. And that requires, I think you said it as well, Paul, it's made our jobs a little bit harder. Maybe a lot harder in some cases, just a wee bit. But it's also the right thing to do. So using the Northwest Forest Plan land allocations, working with the wildlife specialists, working with the fuels management specialists on the dry side, working with the timber folks on both sides of the Cascades, we can achieve these mutual objectives and hopefully achieve recovery of the owl. At the same time, it also encourages, and we want to continue to encourage, especially on the dry side, the use of fuels management and fire especially. Part of the active management prescription and discussion in the rule and in the recovery plan really talks about using fire, really talks about the role of fire on the landscape. And for the Forest Service, implementing that on the east side seems like the right thing to do. We have the resources and the skills over there and the right landscapes to do that. I don't think anybody is expecting us to be using fire on the wet west side. So just to clarify that.
Only every 600,
Only every 600 or 700 years, yeah. Yeah. But along those lines, using fire, I think, is going to become a more and more important objective and opportunity for us, so we'll be pursuing that. And then I guess the last thing is it does really, and we mentioned it makes our jobs a little bit harder, but it also allows us to work together closer. And so one of the things that we've been successful at over the last year is the level 1 teams and the level 2 teams who are implementing this are working closely together in addressing the specific needs of an individual forest project. And the rule and Fish and Wildlife Service gives us that flexibility to have those project-specific discussions, talk about the objectives of the project, work together to meet them and find that balance. Because as we move through these projects, there are going to be short-term impacts. Paul mentioned them, it doesn't preclude take. Critical habitat is not a hands-off land allocation. We've had many discussions, it's not a land allocation at all. It's a designation. And we have to achieve that balance between active management, short-term impacts, and the long-term goals of restoration that we're trying to achieve. So that's what we're in it for, and we're in it for the long run. That's what I have.
Thank you. Okay, Lee?
All right. So good morning, everyone. I'm Lee Folliard with the Bureau of Land Management, and happy to be here. And I thought I would sort of pick up, I mean, looking at the agenda and kind of the discussion ahead of us today, it reminds me a lot of almost this time last year when the directors of our agencies, Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM, and Forest Service, came out to Washington, Oregon, and California to really show their support for the intent of the rule and what Paul talked about. You know, it's not a reserve, it's not hands-off. And our directors came out and really tried to speak that message collectively to probably some of you. Can I see a show of hands of folks that were able to attend one of those sessions? Okay, so quite a few of you were able to listen to our leadership from Washington come out, and like I say, they gave their collective support to that, and I think that's what you're going to hear this morning from the three of us, kind of collective support for this rule. And so I just wanted to build on a few things from where Paul and Debbie kind of took the discussion to kick things off. And I wanted to just say, I think this, the critical habitat rule, it gives all of us a chance for some new thinking in how we look at the landscape and how we look at particularly federal forest management and what we're trying to achieve. And, you know, it reminds me of when the rule first came out, or actually, you know, kind of back to the proposed rule, and the service was talking about active management and what is that, and you know, everybody was asking, well, what is active management? When is the service going to tell us what active management is? And, you know, everyone was waiting for the answer. And I think in parallel to this effort, there was discussions emerging even before the critical habitat rule on ecological forestry and what role that could play in federal forest management. And you know, Dr. Norm Johnson with us today and Dr. Jerry Franklin, I think we're, you know, talking quite a bit about that and how that could be integrated into federal forest management. And I think you see that integrated into the critical habitat rule very explicitly. So I think this sets us up to think about the ecosystem and how we can manage for the ecosystem. And spotted owls are a part of that, but there are many other interests out there. And I think it also helps us think about, you know, what I think is an unsustainable situation if we continue to try and manage species by species across the landscape. If we continue to try and have, you know, special land allocations for every species out there, sooner or later that the landscape would be covered. So I think this helps us think about forest management and the ecosystem and what's good for the forest and development of habitat for older forest-associated species, how that can be a good thing. Now, and then, you know, we're challenged to sort of translate that into management on the ground. I think the other challenge we have in thinking broadly at the ecosystem level is our process brings us back to the individual species. And what I mean by that is, you know, ultimately we have to come back into consultation that Paul was talking about, and consultation drills down and focuses on individuals and take, and you know, so we've got some things that we can continue to work on and get better at as well. As far as, you know, I mentioned active management, and there was a lot of, you know, early on, what is that? And my sense is we're kind of figuring that out a little bit, and I know from the BLM's perspective, you know, we've done some things with ecological forestry pilot projects that I think have helped us explore some of these new concepts, and we're continuing along the lines of doing different types of activities in spotted owl critical habitat. I think it, you know, sort of under the guise of active management, but I hear that term less and less because I think we're figuring some of that out, and we are, I think, looking at how can we integrate ecological considerations into some of our economic considerations. That said, critical habitat is not the only driver for us when we go out to manage these lands. We have to, you know, I think the rule talks about, you know, taking a very ecological approach to forest management, and we try to do that in BLM, but there are many other drivers that push us to eventually where we lay out projects on the ground. And sometimes, I mean, the ecological factors and the social factors and species factors, they all need to come together. And at times we're searching for some of the least controversial situations that we can find. And that's, I don't think that's our discussion today, but that's just the reality of how sometimes we navigate developing projects out there. So we're continuing to explore these things, and I think we're getting better in not only the different things we're exploring, but in working together on these projects. I mean, I can't say enough about how I see our local units out there. Many of you are here today, working with the local Fish and Wildlife Service folks to talk about these projects early on and kind of working from the start to the finish together. And I think that's going to be important for the future. And lastly, I thought I would just comment on, many of you are aware of, the BLM in Western Oregon is in a resource management plan revision process. So we are, actively developing new resource management plans for our Western Oregon districts. And as part of that, we will be looking at the critical habitat and how can we manage all of our Western Oregon lands in sort of concert with the goals of critical habitat. And you'll see, I mean, we've got some public documents out now. We have a range of sort of preliminary alternatives that explore sort of different levels of treatment in critical habitat. And so we're not at the point of any final decisions, but that again is an effort where, we'll be working closely with Fish and Wildlife Service and how we go through that and eventually end up at, an even larger sort of strategy in how we're going to integrate critical habitat with our future management. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Cheryl.
Open up for questions?
Sure.
Sure.
Questions? Lady in the front?
I have a question, mostly for Lee. You mentioned the unsustainability of managing species by species, which I totally agree with. But originally, spotted owls were meant to represent the old growth ecosystem. Do you think that's still true, or should there be other species we're looking at to represent the old growth ecosystem? What are your thoughts on that?
If you can recapsulate the question.
Okay, so the question is, to what extent does the spotted owl represent other species as far as meeting conservation needs for,
Representing the old growth.
or representing the old growth ecosystem? And I guess my thought is, at least for BLM, when Paul mentioned, I think there was, this critical habitat designation is much bigger than the previous designation. And when you look at BLM lands, the current designation is about 50% of our lands. And so one would hope if we'd have identified the right areas, that 50% of 2.2 million acres can represent something more than the spotted owl, that there will be many other species that are going to benefit from that. And so I'd like to think if we're doing a good job sort of listening to and practicing some of the goals in spotted owl critical habitat, we're meeting the needs of many other species.
Can I take a stab at that? Yeah, thanks. I think that's a real fundamental question, a fundamental issue. We've, Forest Service and BLM and Fish and Wildlife and Park Service and, pretty much anyone who's managing wildlife, fish, and landscapes keeps coming back around. We keep cycling through this. We did ecosystem management, and Forest Service has done different things. And right now, Fish and Wildlife Service is cycling through that again with the surrogate species concept. And we have a new initiative from our director called Surrogate Species. Spotted owls are a classic surrogate species, umbrella species. And there's all these other kinds of surrogates, keystone, umbrella, various indicators, focal, you name it. Engineering, beaver is one of my favorite, But the other thing, from a management perspective, managing really singularly for spotted owls is kind of crazy at this landscape level, frankly. Because we got Fisher lining up, we've got martin behind it, we've got tree vole that we already did, we've got salmon, we've got steelhead, we've got trout, we've got lamprey, we've got now a bunch of invertebrates that are on various queues. We just got a NOI from the Center for Biological Diversity a couple of days ago about 5 salamanders, and so we're going to be chasing these individual species. So what we're recommending in the recovery plan for the spotted owl and in the critical habitat rule and a lot of our other stuff is to manage more broadly for ecological processes to the extent we can do that. And the Forest Service especially has tremendous research leadership and capability in doing that, and I think we're going to hear a little bit about that maybe later today. I'll just mention one sort of paper that was influential on me personally and that we cite to a lot, and a lot of our is now 30-something years old by Ed Rickliffs and Paul Ehrlich, and it's called Conservation of Ecological Processes. And, conserving these processes and the species then that exist within that should take care of themselves. I mean, theoretically. Obviously, certain species are on the edge of different situations, and we got to keep an eye on them for sure. But these lands should be managed for sort of ecological integrity, ecological health, resilience, and that's even more important now in the face of the climate change issue. And as Debbie said, sort of addressing or rectifying, to the extent we can understand it ecologically, the consequences of past management actions, whether it's timber harvest, fire suppression, a lot of grazing in forested systems, things like that. And can we manage for processes and either assume or interpret that the species within them will kind of work it out? We can manage for flying squirrels very specifically, but what about everything else then? Oh yeah, that's good for owls, but it's only good for actually, that part of their life history. It doesn't take care of a lot of other things. So that's the frustration and the challenge we face. And then how do you operationalize that? How do you sort of make it so that you can actually go in and do a lot of what your colleagues back at the home office need to do and meet other public mandates? So we've come a little bit closer in that, I think, in what we've done in the last couple of years, but I don't think we're even nearly far enough. And that's why I will, I'll give a shout out to Norm and Jerry for taking that on and helping us try and bridge the management and this basic ecological and bringing those together. A lot of people don't like it because they either don't agree with the ecological interpretation or they're worried about the risk, and there is a lot of risk. But the only thing riskier than doing some of what we're doing, I think, is doing nothing. So, did you want to address that at all?
Thanks for that easy question, Joan. We're out of time now. Does anybody else have one more quick question we can squeeze in? Yes, sir.
I had a question about managing for disturbances, and you talked about dry side ecosystems, well, wet side ecosystems. We actually have some pretty nasty exotic diseases, one of which is called sudden death. And as far as doing proactive treatments to manage for tannin, which is the host, and try to remove those as in areas that are modeled to be high risk for spread. We're not able to do that. And just what your thoughts are of exotic diseases and the ecology of the system, which don't necessarily match.
So I guess when you say we're not able to do that, my radar goes up, like, why not? What's going on in the rest of the landscape that's preventing that? It goes back to looking at the whole landscape and figuring out how to fit that management objective into the larger landscape. I don't think there's anything in the critical habitat rule that prevents you from managing and controlling sudden oak death, right? I don't think so.
In fact, oak is one of our surrogate species in the Willamette Valley now
Right.
that we're actually talking about doing more action on.
So when you say what's preventing you, I'd say encourage you to look at what management barriers are you boxing yourself in with. And we can have a conversation later about the specifics of your question, because I think that's a great example of where we should be doing something. I mean, that's about treating the landscape and managing for more than just owls.
We're going to have to move on to the next speaker. Help me thank these guys for kicking us off. If If they manage to hang in till 3:20, they'll be back up this afternoon for additional questions, so keep your thoughts. Thank you, guys. I heard 3 things from them, 4 things actually, that we're seeking a balance, we're in it for the long run, there is a collective support, and I like Lee's new thinking. We need to be creative and think of have some new ideas out there, get outside of the box.